Morning, friends. Morning. So over the next few weeks, I should just say by way of a disclaimer, I've eaten too many cookies and brownies outside this morning, so if I talk fast and slightly jittery this morning, it's the sugar. All right. Okay, so over the next few weeks, I'm going to be talking with you about something that when you went to catechism class as a kid, the priest probably called it the doctrine of Christ. And I'm going to be talking about that as it relates to the Christmas story. That we should be here in Toronto in the year 2019 talking about Jesus of Nazareth is in some respects a strange thing to be doing, because Jesus, as you know, was born roughly 2,000 years ago in the ancient Near Eastern equivalent of Timmins. You know, the kind of town where pickup trucks are sporty and plaid shirts are sexy. The kind of town where your father met your mother at Walmart. Speaking of which, Jesus' mother was a poor, unmarried teenage girl, and his adoptive father worked in construction. And for the first 30 years of his life, this is where Jesus lived, and this is what Jesus did. In our parlance, Jesus drove a pickup truck, wore a plaid shirt, swung a hammer, and made stuff with his hands all day long. And then, at the age of 30 or so, he gave up the construction industry and started telling people about religion. And his religious career got off to an amazing start, but very quickly it went downhill. I mean, Jesus bombed more than I ever did. Yeah. Here's how badly Jesus' religious career bombed. I don't know what he was like as a construction worker, but at the end of his career, a crowd of people who he tried to help got up in a public place and said, "Nah, let's crucify him." Nice. When he was dying on a cross, some of those same people who he tried to help showed up to laugh. Took a picnic. It'd be fun. Let's all laugh. And when you see it like that, Jesus' resume is rather simple. When set alongside the many remarkable characters from the ancient world, Jesus stands out for being entirely unremarkable. He was a poor construction worker whose religious misadventures ended in his untimely demise. And yet, curiously, that nondescript construction worker became the most famous person who ever lived. The ancient hammer-swinging, drywall-hanging teacher of religious truth is everywhere. He has thoroughly permeated world history and the darker, weirder corners of contemporary culture. For example, a few years ago, the cable channel A&E had a fascinating reality show called Dog the Bounty Hunter. The rough and ready star of this show is the Christian bail bondsman, which isn't, I didn't know that was an option as a career, but there you go, called Dwayne Chapman. And in every episode, just before his mullet-wearing, mace-spraying, chain-smoking posse go on a manhunt, they gather in a circle and ask Jesus to bless their manhunt. I've prayed many prayers in my life. Never that. Jesus also makes the occasional appearance in the world of fashion. A few years ago, this Jesus is my homeboy t-shirt was all the rage, gracing the bodies of Ashton Kutcher, Madonna, Pamela Anderson, Brad Pitt, and no doubt a few fashion-conscious people at your gym. Slightly cheesy, but there you go, Jesus often is cheesy. All over the world, people sing songs to Jesus. They read books about Jesus. They create artwork that depicts Jesus. Jesus has been the subject of more films than any fictional or historical character in history. My personal favourite is Jesus Christ Vampire Hunter. If you like Mexican wrestling, kung fu, vampires and Jesus, that's the one for you. Jesus, you probably don't know this, but Jesus even has his own talk show. This man, Neil Saverda, who I think could be my brother, pretends to be Jesus on his Saturday morning talk show in LA. The name of the talk show is called The Jesus Christ Show. And all it is brilliant. People phone in with their problems, and my brother answers them as though he were Jesus. And people pay him for that. It's completely awesome. And why not? Now, As an amateur, and I do emphasize the word amateur historian, I have to ask, how exactly does that happen? How does a construction worker, that's all he is, construction worker, from a one-horse town, who after working 15 years of construction, suddenly got into religion, his religious career not too good, how does that guy end up being the go-to guy for redneck bounty hunters, Canadian cult filmmakers, t-shirt fashion designers, and LA talk show hosts? Indeed, and more to the point, how does this person get to loom so large over culture that we separate time according to before and after his birth? And even more to the point, how is it that this person ends up being prayed to and worshipped by millions, indeed billions of people throughout history and throughout the world? It just doesn't make any sense. And it forces us to ask the question, who is this man born in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago, the construction worker turned global icon? Have a look at this. Jesus said of himself that he had come down from heaven. That is a strange turn of phrase, is it not, to have come down from heaven? Occasionally we read stories about people who've gone up from heaven. For example, in 1989, a man called Don Piper was killed in a horrific road traffic accident. And when I say killed, what I mean is dead. Dead as in, by the time the paramedics showed up, they could find no signs of life. So what they did was they covered his body in a tarp and left it by the side of the road for 90 minutes. Seems a long time to leave a fellow lying by the side of the road, but there you go. 90 minutes later, for some reason, a passerby stops, feels compelled to get out of his car, walk through the carnage, walk over to the tarp, and pray for the deceased. Following which, remarkably, in fact, and I'm sorry, unbelievably, the deceased came back to life. I'm not making this up. In 2004, Don Piper, who died in 1989, wrote a best-selling book about the 90 minutes he had been dead. He called the book 90 Minutes in Heaven. In this book, he claims to have met some of his dead relatives and some people he knew from way back when. And you know, there's a part of me finds that comforting and nice and optimistic and hopeful, but I am nevertheless a skeptic. There's a big part of me thinks, that's a great way to sell a best-selling book. But such a claim, ridiculous as it is nothing. Nothing compared to what the construction worker said about himself. He didn't say he went up to heaven. He said he came from heaven. And for a former construction worker from a one-horse town, that claim is nothing short of astonishing. And it was this claim, this statement, that persistently landed Jesus in trouble. Have a look at this. So the Apostle John tells us that at this, the Jews there began to grumble about him because, why? Why did they grumble about him? Why did they hate him? Why did his career end so badly? Because he said, I have come down from heaven. In the first century, for a person to say that they were the bread, like he says in this sentence, that came from heaven, they were to say that they were the living embodiment of everything that they believed about God himself. And so they said, is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he say, I came down from heaven? In an earlier part of my career, I worked in a small fishing village in the northeast coast of Scotland. And one of the wonderful character traits of people in that village was that they had very limited tolerance for pretensions or delusions of grandeur. So say, for example, a young person in the village started a business, and that business became very successful. So successful that the young person began to get a bit big for their boots and act as though they were something they weren't. People had this saying, it went like this: I kent your father. Kent is the Scottish word for know. I know your father. Like, who do you think you are? Acting the big shot. I know your father. He was a fisherman. And your grandfather was one, and your great-great-grandfather was one. Notice the slight in this sentence then on the screen. How can we know Jesus? He lives in 42 Acacia Avenue, Main Street in Nazareth. How can he say he has come from heaven? What a joke. For the last 15 years, he's been working construction. What a joke. We know his father. Wink, wink. Was he not? Remember the Christmas story? We'll get into it in a few weeks. We know his mother. It's a small village. You think Mary had a good reputation in that village? I'll tell you who Mary was. Like, lay it on the line. A teenager who got pregnant before she was married, and she said God did it. Two options when you hear that story. It's either true or you're a wee bit mental. So what kind of reputation do you think Jesus, the construction worker, had in his small town? He had a mentally unstable mother and some sucker father who was or wasn't his real dad, but kind of put up with this crazy lady. That's Jesus. Hence the incredulity in this sentence. How can he say, this construction worker with this family, that he has come down from heaven? I know this guy. He did the drywall in my basement. Took him forever. And now he's God. You're laughing. They weren't having it. They weren't having it. So the thing about, get this is important. The thing about Jesus that stuck in people's throats and riled them the wrong way was not so much what he said, but rather who he said he was. You'll have perhaps have noticed that one of the things that people consistently say about Jesus was that he was a nice person, or a good moral teacher, or something of that nature. For example, the LGBT Act, LGBTQXYZ, whatever it's called now, the LGBT activist Sandra Bernard famously said, I'm sure that Jesus was a really incredible person. And there you go, that's nice. Maybe we could be friends. Maybe we could sit down and agree about something. You think Jesus was incredible? I think Jesus was incredible. And this is a typical view of Jesus that almost everyone espouses. Doesn't matter if they're a Christian or a hardcore atheist or everything in between. Jesus was a good man. How can you disagree? What's not to like? Everyone likes good people. Jesus was an exemplary moral teacher. Well, that's all right. Everyone likes morality. Everyone likes good teaching. But this rather insipid view of Jesus just doesn't stand up to any historical or literally analysis of the Gospels. Think about it. It's not that hard. If Jesus was so nice, and if his moral teaching was so exemplary, then why was he so hated by so many people? Why pretty much every time Jesus opened his mouth, a certain percentage of the crowd wanted to kill him? Why for like 95% of his religious career did the best religious people in his country devote hours of their lives trying to figure out how to get rid of him. You don't do that to nice people. You don't do that to exemplary moral teachers. If the documents that we now call the Gospels are an accurate and historical reflection of the life of Jesus, then evidently Jesus was both much less and much more than we today give him credit for. Jesus did not say that he was a good man. He did not pretend to be an exemplary moral teacher or leader. Those are all bland, meaningless statements that we subsequently attached to him, no doubt to neutralize the threat of what he actually was and said, which was that he was God and that he came down from heaven. And this is why Jesus was controversial, and this is exactly why he was killed. Have a look at this. Jesus elsewhere said that I and God the Father are one. Now when Jesus said that, in a fiercely monotheistic culture like first century Israel, look at what his audience do. Immediately, his Jewish opponents pick up stones to stone him. I've been preaching 22 years, never happened to me once. Did you say not yet? Thank you. Just to clarify, has anyone got heavy objects in the church? This is what Jesus was. He spoke, people picked up heavy things to throw at him. Jesus said, hey, what's with the rocks? What's with the bricks? For which of my, how does he phrase it? I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? In other words, was it the person I healed? Was it the person I helped see? Was it the person I helped walk? Was it my sermon yesterday? I mean, what did I do? Why are you picking up rocks to throw them at me? They said, look at it. We are stoning you for blasphemy. Because you, a man. I mean, you spent 15 years of your life in construction, and what, now you're the Son of God? That's why. The foundation of everything that he said and everything that he did was that he was God. And that makes him a threat, right? If I were to talk to you about some nice guy who said some nice things, you would think that it was nice. And I could do that. Pick a character at random. Seneca, my second favourite writer from the ancient world. I read what he said most weeks, sometimes most days. Helps shape my worldview. I could tell you about Seneca, I could tell you about his life, I could tell you about the stuff he said, and it would inspire you, it would help you, it would or it would not, but it would not be a threat. It would not be a threat. However, when we talk about someone who said they were God, the God who made you, the God who watches over you, the God who will one day in kindness and mercy and grace judge your soul, that's a whole other ballgame. That's challenging. That's personal. That's not nice anymore. That's now a threat. C.S. Lewis, the guy who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, famously said, a man who said he was a man and who did the sort of things that Jesus said, the sort of things that Jesus said, could not be a great moral teacher. He would either have to be a lunatic on the same level with a man who said that he was a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your own choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something else. Let us not come up with any patronizing nonsense about him being a great human teacher. He has not left that option open to us. He did not intend to. Now, moving on a little. If Jesus, the construction worker, really did come down from heaven, let's accept that, and if he really was God, as we believe him to be, then that raises another question, which is, what kind of a construction worker was he? For example, would he have had calluses on his hands? Would he have showed up 2 weeks late for a job? Would he have laughed at fart jokes? Would he have sighed in satisfaction when he had a beer at the end of a hot, hard day's work? Would he have had a muscular frame? Would he have looked like a working man? I mean, Jesus, remember, how old do you start working in the ancient world? Let's say 15 at the latest, probably a lot younger. And he did that until he was 30. So for at least 15 years, Jesus worked construction. What did he look like? How did he act? What was he? I ask this because if Jesus was God, then to what extent was he also man? How manly can God be? For example, have a look at this. So this is a painting of the Virgin Mary with baby Jesus. And this is fairly typical of church art. So you'll notice that baby Jesus has the obligatory halo around his head. Notice also that although in the painting he is a child, he nonetheless has a face of an adult. He's basically a mini-me of his later self. I don't know about you, but if I slept with a child like this in my house, I'd sleep with one eye open. This is like Chucky Jesus. Right? It is, right? It's like, I'd have The Exorcist on speed dial. This is creepy. There's that hymn, we used to, I'm not going to sing it or rap it. I'll just say it. We used to sing it in primary school in Scotland. You perhaps did here too. Maybe you're not allowed to sing hymns in school anymore, but we were back in the day. And little Lord Jesus, asleep in the hay, no crying he makes. Remember that? Nice. Little baby Jesus, asleep in the hay, no crying he makes. Is that true? Can it be true? Did baby Jesus have a halo around his head? Did he behave abnormally well? Was he never the cause of a sleepless night for his teenage mother or his adoptive father? If that's the case, then Jesus may have looked human, but he clearly wasn't. Let's have a look at one more. So this is a famous piece of art called Christ the King. To me it looks more like Christ the drag queen. Notice please the feminine hands and the skinny fingers and the smooth skin. This man moisturizes. This man wears silk pajamas. This man may be many things in this life, but this man is not a construction worker. This man doesn't wield a hammer 8 hours a day. Let's get that straight. And I think that when we read sentences in the Bible that talk about Jesus coming down from heaven and being God, this is precisely the sort of otherworldly, superhuman imagery that we end up with. And it is obviously farcical. It is obviously wrong. The early historical documents of the church, which is all we have to go on, suggest that the construction worker who said he was God was also a construction worker. That the man who said of himself that he had come down from heaven was also a man. For example, have a look at this. This is all I got, right? This is all we have to go on are the documents. This comes from an early Christian document called the Gospel of St. Luke. And speaking about Jesus' childhood, it actually says that Jesus grew in wisdom. In other words, Jesus grew like every other child in the world grew. Jesus had to go through a learning process. He had to learn how to speak, how to eat, how to walk. As he got older, he had to learn how to live. He had to learn how to handle himself. He had to learn how to be a man. He had to learn how to do things. He had to learn how to frame windows or whatever construction workers do. He had to learn, what was good, but he had to learn all that stuff. Question. If Jesus is God, how does God have to grow in wisdom? In Christian thought, we believe from the Bible that God is all-knowing. The phrase we use is omniscient. That is, God knows all things, both possible and actual, in a single eternal moment. He knows everything, all the time. There is no growing in God. There is no learning in God. What do we make of this sentence then? He grew in wisdom. Strange, confusing. Have a look at this. This sentence comes from right near the end of the Jesus story, after his career just bombed. After Jesus has his worst day. Ooh, there's a statement. Jesus had a worse day. That comforts me. We're told that on his worst day, Jesus began to be sorrowful and troubled. In other words, on this particular day, at the end of his worst day, Jesus had the blues. On this particular day, Jesus was depressed. This does not sound to me like the superhuman, otherworldly, moisturizing figure of early Christian art. And it also raises questions, important ones. How can God be depressed? It is a theological and philosophical impossibility. And on the subject of impossibilities, if Jesus the construction worker was God, then how come all the other stuff is there in the Gospels too? How can he be tempted to sin like the Gospels say he was? How can he experience hunger and loneliness and poverty and amazement and depression? And most of all, if Jesus the construction worker is God, how come he dies? To say that God dies is both theologically and philosophically absurd. Even Nietzsche, when he famously said that God is dead, did not actually mean that there was an actual God that actually died. To say that God dies is philosophical nonsense. It can't happen. So what is this? How does God get the blues? So what sort of a man was this man who said he was God? And how did his godness and his manliness gel together? Well, over the years, people have said that he was 100% God, but that his manliness was a bit fake. In other words, he was a bit like Superman. Really, he was invincible. Really, he was otherworldly. Really, he was beyond the ups and downs and vagrancies and challenges of this life. But he only pretended to be a regular blue-collar construction worker like the rest of us. It was all an act, because deep down he was really like God. So in this train of thought, Jesus is a bit like Donald Trump, I suppose. I should mention Donald Trump, but any millionaire, billionaire politician who turns up in a blue-collar factory town and says, "Hey, I know what you're going through. I know what it's like to struggle to pay the bills and not be able to put food on the table. And I understand. I feel you. I feel you. Can we get out of here back in our car and get back to our mansion now, please?" All a bit of an act. Is that what Jesus was like? Really, he was God, but he just pretended to be poor. He pretended to suffer. Other people, like Dan Brown, who wrote the Da Vinci Code, come at it from the other angle. They say that, Jesus really actually was just a regular construction worker from Nazareth, and after doing that for 15, 17 years, he just got fed up, fixing people's basements, and he thought, now try religion. How hard can it be? And it went well for a few years, and then it didn't, and it just got out of hand. Like the whole Jesus thing got out of hand, and 2,000 years later, here we are believing in Jesus. And none of it was meant to happen. It was all just an accident of history, made up by Constantine or somebody. So which is it? Let's look at some diagrams. What am I looking at here? I did these diagrams myself, so yeah. They're basically crayons. Which is my level, I suppose. So does this diagram here represent the situation with Jesus? Was Jesus just a fusion of God and man? So like 40% God, 60% man, 50-50, whatever. Is that how it was? Or does this next diagram accurately represent the situation? Did Jesus have like a multiple personality disorder? Was there construction worker and God rattling around in the same person? And sometimes he was construction worker who got lonely and bummed out and depressed and angry. And sometimes he was God and he said nice stuff and amazing things. Is that how it was? Or does this next diagram get us closer to the truth? Was Jesus essentially a different species? So did his human nature and his God nature form a new nature? In other words, was Jesus like the first of the X-Men, some evolutionary leap forward to something else? So in the year 451 AD, the church got together, because these questions we're talking about this morning were hot topic issues in the early church. People struggled on either side of the equation. They struggled with the idea that Jesus could be a man, and they struggled with the idea that the man could be God. So they got together in a place called Chalcedon, and they figured this out. And after months of debate, they issued the Chalcedon Creed that bears their name, and this is still the definitive definition of Christian orthodoxy today. I'll just read it for you. Oh yeah, I've got time. I can drone on for ages yet. So, they say this. We then, did I put it on the screen? No, I didn't. We then, following the Holy Fathers, the popes and stuff, with all one consent, teach people to confess one and the same Son, our Lord Christ, the same perfect in Godhead and perfect in manhood, both truly God and truly man, of a reasonable soul and body, consubstantial with the Father according to God, and consubstantial with us according to man. In all things like us, but without sin, begotten before all ages of the Father according to God, and in these latter days for our salvation, born of the Virgin Mary according to man, one and the same Christ, Son, Lord, only begotten, to be acknowledged by the Church in two natures, inconfusedly, unchangeably, indivisibly, inseparably. The distinction of the two natures by no means taken away by the union, but rather the property of each being preserved and concurring in one person, not parted or divided into two, but one, the same Son, and only begotten God the Word, the Lord Jesus Christ. In other words, here is our view of the early church and still today. Jesus, the construction worker from Nazareth, was and is a real man, 100%, and real God, 100%. 100% human, 100% divine. So when we talk about Jesus in the Bible, when we talk about his birth at Bethlehem, we're talking about a person who was fully God and fully man in one person, and still is today, and will be so forever. This raises questions. Two. Question number one. And this matters for you and me who live the lives we live. who struggle with the struggles we have and the fears we have and the things we got to do and get through. Here it is. If Jesus was and is still today just a regular human being who worked construction most of his life, who knew what it was to be angry and betrayed and falsely accused and hated, and cold, scared, does it help you to know that he knows what it's like to be you? Does it help you to know that this man knows what it's like to live in the world of real men and women, with all of its sadness and joy, with all of its temptation and hardship, with all of its betrayal and bereavement and anger and hatred and messed upness? Does it help you to know that the Jesus to whom you pray, he knows how it feels? I've been to fancy churches in Europe and stuff. And I've stood before the statues. You know the drill with the gold and all that. And you do your thing. Say your prayers. Why not? That's not Jesus. Jesus is a working man in working man's clothes who's been through it. And he knows. He understands. I can talk to a man like that. I can listen to a man like that. Second question. If Jesus, the man, was and is today also God, what implications does that have for you as you consider your relationship to him and the things he said? About forgiveness, about money, about family, about hatred, about what's important. Like if it's God we're talking about, what implications does that have? And on that note, we'll make room for Frozen 2. But before we do, let's bow our heads and pray. Yeah, so our Heavenly Father, we know you know all of it. The fear, the anger, the stabs in the back, the loneliness, the going without, the hard work, the struggles, the blues. We know you know. And so we bring to you our stuff. And we bring it in faith, believing that not only do you know, but that you also care. That you love us. And that you're able to help. And it is for that help we ask. For we need it. Through Christ our Lord, hear our prayer.